Then I'd like to welcome you, you both, and welcome everyone else to the fourth edition of these COVID Flash Talks, entitled Reflection on Emptiness in Times of COVID-19. My name is Morris Kirschbaum. I'm a student in the MSc of Migration Studies, and I will moderate this today with Tamoy Fuji, who is an MSc in Global Governance and Diplomacy, both at ODID. The COVID Flash Talks is a new initiative that's supported by ODID and COMPAS, which aims to create a space in which academic debate can be started around this current COVID-19 pandemic with reference to the issues dealt inside of the department. And on logistics, so the first 25 minutes of today, we'll have the two talks by Dace and Mathilde. We'll present their research also based on the articles that are linked in the event. And then we'll go right into the Q&A. And we hope to finish with the concluding remarks around 2:50. But at any time during the talks, you can submit in the Q&A function, and we'll just go through them at the Q&A. And to introduce our two speakers, Professor Dace Dzenovska is an associate professor in the Anthropology of Migration, where she teaches my master's in migration studies, amongst other things. She specializes in political anthropology and focuses on three areas: the geopolitics of mobility and migration, forms of statehood, sovereignty, and anti-capitalism in post-Cold War Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and post-socialism as a critical lens for the analysis of late liberalism. And in the past, we've also had the pleasure of having her teach this and also the perspective of emptiness on her native Latvia. And then joining us from Paris is Mathilde Morin. She's studying for the MSc in Social Anthropology at St. Anthony's College. She was born in France, raised in the US and Switzerland, and in Germany. And she started with philosophy in France, specializes in East Asian studies, and also then spent a year in Japan. And she came to the University of Oxford to deepen her knowledge of social anthropology, a discipline that she discovered when she was in her year in Japan. In her free time, she also does a lot of haikus that she was nice enough to share with us, which are very, very nice. I think even daily, you said at one point. But with that out the way, if you'd be so kind, Dace, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. So I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay. I'm assuming you can see me well, just nod your head if you see the screen. Okay, great. So I've been following the circulation of images of empty towns and villages for some time now. In the pre-coronavirus era, they usually concerned socialist or capitalist deindustrialization. The viewing public, usually global and cosmopolitan, consumed them as aesthetically pleasing representations of remote ruination. It was someone else's world that was falling apart. This has now changed. News and social media platforms are full of images of the empty streets of global capitals and cities of the global south: Paris, Milan, New York, Moscow, Caracas, Rawalpindi, and more. Sites dedicated to capturing city life have even been recording the sounds of emptiness. And let me see if I can share this with you. Okay, that's somehow not. No share. Okay, so we're going to listen to sounds of emptiness. Just a little. Okay. This new emptiness is simultaneously appealing and frightening. On the one hand, the empty streets of Paris in springtime appeal to the global cosmopolitan subject's aesthetic appreciation of decaying, suspended, or interrupted forms of modern life. On the other hand, these empty streets suggest that it is their or our future that is under threat. Empty streets of today entail a potential and increasingly actual collapse of the economic and social life tomorrow. Another striking aspect of pandemic emptiness is the proliferation of images and narratives of the so-called nature reclaiming space in the form of weeds in the squares of Rome, or animals in Ahmedabad, India, Buenos Aires, Argentina, Venice, Italy, and here in the UK, Wales, among many others. I'm sure you've seen these images. Environmental activists, and not only environmental activists, suggest that the new normal is not all bad, that there's less pollution, cleaner water, more animals. My own trip to Blackpool, UK in March, however, suggested that this is not simply nature returning. It may also be urban disequilibrium. When I was on the beach in Blackpool, I was surrounded by hangry, that is angry and hungry, seagulls with no people to feed them. I was their only hope. My March trip to Blackpool, UK also reminded me of forms of emptiness I had been studying before the lockdown. Blackpool's streets were empty, but it was difficult to distinguish between seasonal rhythms. The beach season hadn't started yet, it was before Easter, the extraordinary suspension of life due to coronavirus, and the more lasting abandonment of people and buildings that had been ongoing since at least the 70s, when vacationers started going to Spain instead of Blackpool. And Blackpool is indeed a really interesting case, because instead of becoming empty as a result of decline of tourism, Blackpool has actually been filling up with what the media has suggested or referred to as England's poor and infirm, who flock to the cheap hotels, residences. But this is a topic for another time. So let me take a step back from the pandemic emptiness and talk a little bit about the kind of emptiness that I study and how I think it helps to make sense of the pandemic emptiness we're seeing now. I first encountered emptiness in Eastern Latvia, where people used the term when they pointed to abandoned buildings, spoke of friends and relatives who had emigrated, lamented the closure of schools and cancellation of transportation routes, and feared the disappearance of their town or village from the map. Indeed, since 1990, 34 train routes have been shut down and 11 physically dismantled in Latvia. Since 2009, 171 schools have been closed and many integrated into other school districts. The disappearance of people, the crumbling buildings, and the deteriorating infrastructure have led to the disappearance of settlements from the map. Since 2001, when the Latvian State Land Register began to collect information about villages taken off the map by municipalities, the number of villages in Latvia has decreased by 2,770, by about 20%, if not a bit more. Being taken off the map meant that villages defined as territorial units with concentrated and planned residential buildings with infrastructure and continuously residing people, that they were being dissolved as territorial units. While they did not necessarily represent a hole on the map, therefore, they stopped being coordinates on the map through which territory was conceived and planned. In such conditions, many of Latvia's rural residents imagined the future as an entirely different world in which they will have no part. Sometimes they imagine this future as nature taking back what humans had wrested from it, not unlike what we're seeing now. And sometimes they imagined as a takeover by another civilization, for example, the Chinese. However, emptiness was not only about the absence of people or infrastructure. Emptiness was materially present in the form of abandoned industrial buildings, homes without people, schools without students, and train tracks without trains. This generated new activity. The abandoned buildings needed to be dismantled or cordoned off to prevent antisocial behavior. Infrastructure gaps needed to be filled. The unpaid bills for the upkeep of empty homes needed to be dealt with. Meanwhile, the thinning out of customary social relations and then engendered also the formation of new ones. For example, an elderly woman whose children had left the country relied on intermittent help from a neighbor her children's age who needed a few euros for cheap alcohol. So in the absence of family members, the remaining residents formed a makeshift family. Emptiness also had a sensual dimension. The smell of damp basements in urban areas suggested emptying apartment buildings, the sound of doors swinging in the wind, an abandoned house in the countryside. Some of my interlocutors claimed that passing empty homes made them feel anxious, even a little nauseous. It was precisely this affective dimension, seeing abundant apple trees by abandoned homes, that conjured up an orientation towards the future as something radically different, but not yet graspable in language. I came to see that in the Latvian countryside, emptiness was a complex social formation that consisted of one, observable reality, that is, places rapidly and seemingly irreversibly losing their constitutive elements, people, schools, infrastructure, social networks. Two, a way of life, that is, practices and social relations that emerged as residents attempted to make life go on. And the third dimension of emptiness was the interpretive frame that local residents used, namely the language of emptiness that they used to describe the new reality, which they perceived to be a sort of a transitional state between a world that was ending and a world that could not yet be seen. So when people in Latvia use the terms emptying and emptiness to describe this radical and yet not quite legible change, they weren't suggesting that there's nothing there, or that emptiness in any sort of straightforward sense is the opposite of fullness. That instead people described changes in the landscape. For example, meadows where there used to be cultivated fields. They described changes in the relationship between humans and their environment. For example, foxes walking down the main street in broad daylight, which would not have happened before. They describe changes in the material state of things, that is, decaying buildings and weeds coming through windows. Changes in infrastructure, they already aforementioned the closure of transportation routes, and also changes in the composition of the community, that is, emigration. So rather than disappearing entirely, things were rearranged in a way that seemed wrong or even illegible to the residents. For example, residents were used to a particular balance between human and non-human environments where nature meant cultivated landscape. So then they were troubled by the sight of these wildly abundant apple trees growing next to abandoned farmsteads, that what seemed abundance maybe to some seemed emptiness to them. When imagining the future, my interlocutors in rural Latvia did not suggest that there will be nothing there in their place of residence, or that they will die, though many of them will. But rather they suggested that there will not be a future for the people and the place together. While the future of the place remained unknown, the future trajectories of some of the concrete people were easier to imagine, right? So some will die, others will emigrate, and some might even succeed with whatever they had started in their place of residence. So how does this actually help us think about pandemic emptiness? First, I think it helps to think about what's simultaneously appealing and uncanny about emptiness. Emptiness invokes nostalgia for a present that we're still living, but that may well end. Second, if emptiness is a lasting state of affairs in the Latvian countryside, pandemic emptiness seems more like a temporary suspension. However, just like in the Latvian countryside, it has its own rhythms: growing weeds, animals, lonely joggers, particular sounds, affective reactions. Pandemic emptiness exposes class differences and entails respatialization and even racialization of economic and political power. Where are the residents of the empty global cities and the cities of the global south? Wealthy and middle-class Parisians, New Yorkers, and Londoners are either in their homes or in their summer residences if they managed to reach them before the lockdown. The homeless remain on the street, though invisible in photos. Many migrant workers have left, while others have been expelled, as is in the case in India. Moreover, if pre-pandemic emptiness was theirs, that is, it was the feature of Russian monotowns, Moldovan villages, or the Latvian countryside, pandemic emptiness is ours, that it is a feature of Paris, London, or our neighborhood here in Oxford. Pandemic emptiness also conjures up particular fears and desires with regard to the future. For some, emptiness presents an opportunity: less people, less pollution, more nature, but this opportunity is available only to a few. For others, pandemic emptiness means crowds on borders or roads as those expelled from the city try to return to the village. And yet for others, pandemic emptiness means unprecedented shock to livelihoods from which it may well be impossible to recover. So in conditions of the pandemic, then, we can observe a temporary respatialization of emptiness. Global cities that were the nodal points of concentration of capital and people at the expense of the emptying towns and villages are now themselves emptying. This doesn't necessarily mean that the previously emptying or shrinking areas are experiencing revival, though some of my colleagues in Latvia did post maps of the country on social media showing the shifting concentration of people from the city to the country as urbanites retreated to their summer houses or as emigres returned, many out of fear that movement might maybe cut altogether. However, any convincing evidence of this is still missing. We don't really have enough data about this. So emptiness remains an in-between state, a state where we can see destruction and possibility side by side without knowing what concrete form life will take. Emptiness then is not only a social formation, not only a new set of practices or an interpretive frame. It is certainly not only an empty metaphor, but it is also an analytical lens, I think, through which we can think about the spatialization and respatialization of economic and political power. Thank you.
Perfectly on time as well, with 20 seconds to go. But let's go straight into your presentation, Mathilde.
Okay, so hello to everyone, and thank you to Maurice and Temoy for inviting me with Dace today. Maurice wrote an uplifting article on the Oxford student website about the unsuspected possibilities of an online Oxford student experience. And I believe that the quality and the originality of this Flash Talk series is truly an example of how we are never more creative and perhaps resourceful than when we face some kind of constraint. And also how the idea and the practice of education, more deeply of knowledge, is being reinvented by this crisis. And these are themes that I'd like to address today in this talk while tackling the question of emptiness. Now, when writing about the events that took place in China in 1989, the so-called Tiananmen Square protests, or more largely the People's Movement, the Dutch anthropologist Frank Pieke, witnessing, or rather, as he writes, unwillingly being caught in these revolutionary times, proposed the concept of total event to describe something that, as he writes, subjected all other events in society to its interpretive framework and could therefore be studied as an autonomous phenomenon. It is an alternative order that was being then constructed, challenging the existing state of affairs. Now, these words, I believe, are strikingly relevant to the COVID pandemic crisis that we are all today precisely caught in. Now, the paradox with this crisis is perhaps that it is a total event that does not seem to generate movement or change, setting, so to speak, into motion the existing state of affairs and laying out the steps needed to reinvent the world. Rather than having the thrilling or terrifying feeling of being propelled in a form of novelty or of witnessing a form of acceleration of time as if history was unfolding before us, we rather face interruption, discontinuation, immobility, and even collapse. It's a kind of timeout, a suspension that disrupts the ever-evolving flow of our postmodern lives. So in this light, I would argue that emptiness in these uncertain times is first and foremost a temporal form of emptiness. The pandemic, as a total event, leaves us distressingly in a pervasive void of time, longing for the world of yesterday, something like an everlasting present in which we linger, unable to imagine possible futures. Totalizing, so to speak, the experience of emptiness, the pandemic crisis has led us to shift to a new temporal mode. A temporal mode characterized by the absence of recognizable directionality. In other words, it is progress that has suddenly stalled. Progress as the very driving force of our collective and individual lives, and progress more deeply as the very stuff of our desires and of our dreams. Now, in her much acclaimed book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist rooms, the anthropologist Antony engrossingly writes that progress still controls us in tales of ruination. Here, Tsing talks about the existential change caused by the entry in the Anthropocene, a new epoch where precarity has, as she writes, become a global state. Now, drawing on Tsing's fertile idea to apprehend this coronavirus era, I would argue that we are in a world where time no longer flows, a world where temporality has been stripped, so to speak, of a telos, aside from that of embracing anew the old world, the world of yesterday, which is arguably a non-telos. And I'd add here, without lingering too much on this, however, that temporal emptiness has its spatial counterparts, which perhaps the idea of social distancing captures most readily. More deeply, the pervasiveness of emptiness in its various spatial temporal configurations that we have come to understand is perhaps not limited to the lockdown strategies deployed globally. It has henceforth become, as Dace has written about post-Soviet Lavia, emptiness in post-Soviet Lavia, a lasting state of affairs. So in her most recent article on emptiness in post-Soviet Latvia, and she reminded this today, the state of emptiness should not be, it shows that the state of emptiness should not be mistaken with one of nothingness, right? Emptiness can be observed, it's a reality with a sensual and affective dimension. And it's also more deeply a way of life that emerges beyond the regnant imaginary of progress, so to speak. So, in other words, progress stalling does not necessarily entail the end of history, to draw on Francis Fukuyama's well-known theory. It calls upon an alternative understanding of the texture of time, another way of telling our stories, as Anna Tsing would perhaps say. So in the wake of this new uncertain reality that is perhaps more resilient than we first thought, and that perhaps must also be traced beyond the coronavirus pandemic itself, finding its origin in capitalist destruction, I argue that social sciences and anthropology more specifically need to refurbish their discourses, to reinvent their heuristic tools, and to create new concepts to canvas this sort of post-progress world. In other words, the temporal emptiness generated by the COVID pandemic perhaps abruptly reveals that it is time now to shift to another scientific paradigm in tune with this kind of swarming emptiness of the new world. We could perhaps then understand this pervasive emptiness and this uncertainty that accompanies it as an extraordinary challenge to venture beyond the boundaries of limited acquisition of exact knowledge, cultivating new ways of learning anchored in curiosity, perhaps humility, something similar to what Anna Tsing calls arts of noticing.
Thank you.